Hi, my name's Ash, and I did something really embarrassing. For a long time, I had a mellow life. My parents loved each other. We lived in an upscale neighborhood, and honestly, I didn't have a problem in the world. But that was all before Rita moved in. Rita is a stunningly attractive woman who moved into the house next to us at the beginning of the summer. My family offered to help her move in after we realized she was all alone. My mom and I went over before my dad got out of work, and I was instantly in love. She was beautiful, sweet, funny, really everything I could ever want. I tried to lug in as many boxes as possible, hoping she would look my way. And then she looked in my direction, shocked, and dropped a box on the ground by accident. Did she realize she was in love with me? Did she see a ghost? I asked if everything was okay, just as my dad rushed out from behind me and helped Rita pick up the box she dropped. She stared at my dad with a glint in her eye, a look I had never seen before. She sheepishly took the box and rushed off. My dad continued on as if nothing had happened. My mom caught the whole exchange and looked like she had just seen her mortal enemy. Did they know each other already? Was there something going on that I didn't know about? The next day, it became even more apparent something weird was going on. Rita knocked on our door, and my dad answered. Rita handed him a tray of cookies, and the two stood on the porch, laughing. My mom walked by the window and looked like she was about to explode. The cookies became a consistent part of Rita's routine. She would drop the cookies off with my dad, talk on the porch for what seemed like hours, and then she'd go home. But one day, it became clear my mom wasn't happy. My mom answered the door and took the cookies with a bitter smile on her face. Rita got super quiet and walked back home. From that point on, Rita didn't bring cookies over anymore, and it became obvious that my dad was the only point of the visits she made. As the weeks went by, I started to notice that Rita was outside in her garden every time my dad left to drop me off at school. But to be honest, her garden looked like someone had planted it with their hands tied behind their back. The flower bed was overrun by weeds. The garden itself barely had any flowers, and I started to realize Rita didn't even have gloves on. She'd sit in the grass with a spade, some seeds, and a watering can and just wait for us to come outside. She'd snatch my dad up in a conversation so often that getting to school late became a common occurrence. I couldn't help but think the entire ride to school, what the heck is going on? Was Rita obsessed with my dad? Had they ever known each other? But the biggest worry of all became, did my dad like Rita? Like that? My mom pulled me aside to have a conversation I never imagined myself having. She told me Rita was the type of woman who was a homewrecker. She deserved to be embarrassed. She deserved to be put in her place. Women like that need to be taught a lesson, my mom told me. Rita had no reason to be talking to my dad. It was obvious what her intentions were. So, my mom asked me if I would help do something embarrassing to make Rita back off. I couldn't help thinking for a second. Wait, is my mom asking me to act like a mean girl? To be a bully? I tried to calm my mom down. I told her Rita shouldn't concern her, that her and dad had a strong relationship, and that obviously nothing would happen. But then, the arguing started. My once happy, mellow, and safe household became a minefield. I never knew what was going on. The tension in the room was almost always unbearable. My mom and dad wouldn't look at each other. We wouldn't have dinner together. We wouldn't do anything together. That's when the screaming started. In the middle of the night, I would lie in bed and hear them yelling at each other in the next room. I'd stare at the ceiling, praying that they would stop, praying they would love each other again. I knew I wasn't in danger. I knew they wouldn't hurt me. But the screaming made every cell in my body supercharged, ready to run, prepared to escape. Soon, their fighting had bled into the day. The minute my dad got home from work, the second my mom even saw Rita, I could never sleep, and soon I felt like I could never eat. I felt anxious all the time. Then the big one happened. After work one day, my mom looked over to see my dad helping Rita with her car. Rita bent over, trying to show him what was wrong. And honestly, it looked really bad. They looked intimate, like they were really flirting, and like Rita was doing all she could to hold my dad's attention. That night, my mom and dad screamed at each other. I heard things being thrown. The house was shaking. Were they going to hurt each other? The word divorce was screamed into the night on what seemed like a loop. Were my parents thinking about a divorce? My parents, who had been high school sweethearts? A fire lit inside me. This had gone too far. The next morning, a Saturday, I rushed down to Mom. I told her I wanted to embarrass Rita. She was tearing my family apart, ruining my entire life. We had to scare off the homewrecker. Mom sat me down, and we went over the plan. We would have a cookout with everyone in the neighborhood at our house. We'd let everyone give a speech on why they love our community. Then, when it was Rita's turn, we'd do what we had to do. At first, everything went off without a hitch. Desperate not to miss a chance seeing my dad, Rita joined us. Prior to the party, Mom and I had rigged up everything needed to run Rita out of town. I stood in the crowd, anxiously awaiting Rita's turn to give her speech. When the time came, my mom would nod at me to press the button. But when Rita got on stage, I froze. Sure, Rita was after my dad, but did she deserve this? Hadn't my dad been talking to her too? Doubt raced through me as my mom motioned for me to press the button. Rita started her speech. She told everyone she was grateful to be in such a lovely neighborhood. She'd been through a lot lately, and getting a chance to be a part of a family again, to be a part of a community once more, had completely changed her life. My finger danced over the trigger. I couldn't do this. I looked over to see tears in my mom's eyes. I followed her gaze to see Rita staring intently at my dad. I plunged my finger down on the button. Red lights flashed. A giant banner came down that read, "Rita is a homewrecker." The worst of all, a tube we hooked up hurled sticky, gross paint all over her. Rita stood in the middle of the stage, dumbfounded. I stepped up, telling everyone how she was ruining my parents' relationship, how I couldn't stand to see my mother cry. We had been so happy. Why couldn't she just leave us alone? Rita's face turned red, and her eyes were full of anger. "Shut up!" she screamed. "You have no right, you little monster! Your father is the one who's been hitting on me!" Rita kept screaming as she accused my dad of all kinds of horrible stuff, while she claimed that she was innocent. My dad stood there speechless. He looked utterly shocked. I kept waiting for him to say something. The real tragedy, however, was when I saw my mom. She looked so sad and disappointed. She must have felt extremely betrayed by my dad. Everyone was waiting for her to react, but she just stood there silently, with tears in her eyes. I had to do something. She had to leave. I told Rita to get out of our house immediately. And with anger brewing in her eyes, she collected her stuff and headed to the door. But that's when my mom said, "You too. Get your stuff and leave with her." My dad then started begging my mom not to believe Rita. He swore that he had no idea what was going on. He said that Rita had even told them that he reminded her of her brother who was away. But my mom wasn't buying any of it, and she insisted that my father left the house immediately. By this point, my dad had figured out that it was a hopeless case. He was about to head out the door, and seriously, the sadness in his eyes was breaking my heart. I had never seen my parents that hurt in my life. But then, something interesting happened. One of the housewives' neighbors came up to my mother and insisted that she should believe my dad because it had happened with her husband too. Then another woman said that it had happened with them too. And soon enough, lots of women at our house were in agreement that Rita was flirting with their husbands. Obviously, Rita was manipulating everyone. My dad then begged my mom to give him another chance. He said he'd had no clue Rita was like that. I knew he was telling the truth because my dad just wasn't the type to do something like that. Finally, my mom agreed to let him stay, and I was beyond relieved. After that, we stopped seeing Rita, and later on, she moved out of our neighborhood. I guess that she finally got the hint that no one wanted to be her friend. Since then, my parents have been communicating better, and things eventually went back to normal.
Hi, my name is Carla. I'm 17 years old, and after my parents passed, I lived with my older sister Stacy and her husband. My parents passed 2 years ago. They died in a terrible car crash on their way back from a business trip in a neighboring town. They co-owned a big corporate business they ran together, and they had really gone on to make names for themselves. I was devastated when I heard the news. My relationship with my parents wasn't like most teenagers. Other teenagers fought and squabbled with their parents at every opportunity. Me? I had a different life. Both my parents were two of my best, if not my best friends. We went out to the movies and to restaurants together. We played and had fun like a regular bunch of teenage friends. Of course, they were stern when they needed to be, but every time they were, I knew that I was in the wrong. So, you can imagine how devastating it was to hear the news on television one night that the two business moguls, who were my parents, had died in a terrible car accident on their way back from a business trip. My best friends were gone. My sister Stacy already moved out of the house a long time ago. It had just been my parents and I for so many years. And it was so amazing how they had managed to take time out for me, even though they were so busy. The news hit me so hard, I sank into depression. The lively, happy Carla that everyone knew had disappeared. In her place was only someone who looked like her. As time went on, I grew worse and worse. I started to withdraw completely from my friends, and I refused to speak to anyone. I came to school in the mornings with swollen eyes, swollen from crying all night and hardly getting any sleep. My sister was crushed. She loved my parents too, but she knew she didn't have the type of relationship with them that I had, and seeing me so sullen filled her heart with pain. She had tried all she could, but nothing was working. She had brought counselors, therapists, and even psychics to help me with my grief, but there was nothing they could do. I just couldn't get better. As the months passed, I sank deeper and deeper into my depression. I was now so alone. I turned to destructive habits for company. It all started with buying drugs from a man who sold them on the corner of the street where I lived with my sister. When I realized they had a way of getting me happy, even for a short time, I couldn't stop. I kept buying them until I became such a wreck. Soon enough, I started on alcohol and smoking, looking for anything at all that could get me as happy as the drugs did. By now, I was so invested in it, I couldn't stop. This continued for a while, and by now, everyone in school knew the kind of life I lived. I came to school every day either drunk or under the influence of some drug, and by now, that was what everyone had come to expect of me. My sister was embarrassed every time the school authorities called her to come pick me up after making a scene, and that happened almost every day. I was worse than a shadow of myself, and deep down, I knew I had let this depression go too far. But I just couldn't bring myself to stop. I couldn't find my way back. I was too far gone. One day, I went back home to my sister's house early from school after the principal annoyed me. He had called me into his office, giving me a last warning after I slammed a basketball in my gym teacher's face for correcting me, leaving his face seriously swollen. "If you throw another fit at the teachers or anyone else, you will be expelled," he said. "We've accommodated this nonsense long enough. You're not the first person to lose their parents. Get a grip on yourself." I was filled with rage. And maybe it was because, deep down, I knew that what the principal said was true. Maybe it was because, deep down, the truth he had blurted out so bluntly had stung me. I stormed out of the principal's office and slammed the door so hard I distracted the whole school from learning for a moment. You can send me out of your stupid school for all I care, I said, well out of hearing distance. I didn't really want to be expelled. It would break Stacy's heart. And I knew it wouldn't have been what my parents wanted. I marched home and pulled a cigarette stick from my backpack as I left the school premises. Those idiots! Who needs them anyway? I marched on until I reached my sister's house, but I totally wasn't ready for what I saw next. My sister's husband was home. He obviously wasn't expecting me back home that early, but it was just noon. I froze in my steps as I saw him. My brother-in-law was nearly butt naked on the couch, and scattered all around him were empty containers of used drugs. Used needles littered the floor and the center table, and I couldn't believe my eyes at what I saw. My sister's husband used drugs too? When did he start? That explained why he rarely said anything every time Stacy tried to correct me. He would look at me but not say anything. At first, I thought he was just staying out of what he considered not to be his business. I couldn't think straight after realizing this. Eventually, I got myself together and walked away to my room, looking away from him. All kinds of thoughts flooded my head all at once. Was I going to tell Stacy what I just saw? What if she left him? What if he was only battling with something terrible like I was, and the drugs were his only way of escape? No, I'm not going to be sympathetic. This could come back and haunt me and my sister later. It was decided. I couldn't wait for Stacy to get back from work. I had to tell her. As I was upstairs in my room waiting for her, her husband came knocking on my door. My heart pounded. "Go away," I said. "I don't want to see you." "I can explain," he said. "Please, don't tell Stacy. I used to be unable to quit drugs before I met your sister, and when she found out, she said she couldn't be with me if I didn't stop. I pleaded with her to stay, that I would try my best because I really loved her, and eventually she helped me through rehab. I was free until you came along with your drugs, alcohol, and smoking. Then all of a sudden, I found myself craving to use drugs again. I battled it for so long, but 3 days ago, I couldn't take it anymore. Please don't tell Stacy. This could be our little secret. See, I brought some new drugs for you to try out. Come on, you'll love it." Now I was offended. There I was, trying to get free, and Stacy's husband was trying to take me deeper in. Any thoughts of covering up for him immediately disappeared. When Stacy got back, I told her what I had seen. I told her I had seen her husband nearly butt naked, surrounded by empty containers of drugs and used needles. I told her that her husband had been using drugs. Stacy shot one look at her husband, begging him to deny it, and when he didn't, she exploded in a rage. Stacy was so mad and upset. I had never seen her like that before. She was screaming, crying, and yelling so hard. I knew by then neighbors already heard and knew what was going on. I walked up to her and tried to hug her to calm her down. "I'm sorry," her husband said, begging and crying on his knees. My sister wasn't having it. "Leave my house," she said. By now, tears were already forming in my own eyes. I knew the right thing to do was to tell my sister, but I didn't want her to lose her marriage. What if I had caught him cheating or doing something much worse? What would she do then? Right there, I knew that I could never tell my sister that he had offered me some of his drugs to bribe me. She would never forgive him. I started to feel very guilty for what I had done. I only imagined that my sister would make him go seek help or something, not send him away completely. It probably hurt her more because she thought he was already done with drugs for good. But still, a pang of guilt flowed over me, especially because he said I had been the trigger that took him back. I didn't know what came over me. Suddenly, I started to beg my sister with tears in my eyes to give him another chance. Somehow, all of this made me realize how much pain I had caused all the other people in my life in the last 2 years. My friends, my sister, and now her husband. I was secretly begging for another chance for myself, to make things right, to try to repair all the damage I had done to everyone around me. Stacy looked at me beg so passionately, and compassion filled her eyes. She told her husband to leave, but that he could come back once he had sought help. I sighed deeply. tears flowing down my face. This was a second chance for me too, and we would have to have our secret after all. Stacy must never find out that her husband offered me drugs, or else their marriage would be over. A few months have passed, and now I'm back to being the old Carla again. Stacy's husband, too, is doing great, and he's almost ready to be back at the house. Pretty soon, we'll be one big happy family.